Let's now turn our attention to paintings in the early Italian Renaissance, and specifically in Florence. Here we are. We're looking at a chapel painted by the artist Masaccio. And this chapel was once owned by the Brancacci family. So if we look at our title here, the artist is Masaccio. And he was paid by the Brancacci family to decorate the interior of the Brancacci chapel. Now, a chapel is a small space for private worship within a larger church. That church is Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. Got it? Let me show you where it is on our map. We cross the Arno River and we're here at Santa Maria del Carmine. Now, we're looking at another chapel. Remember, just as we saw with Giotto's Arena Chapel, a chapel is a smaller space that is usually dedicated or specific to the use of a family or an organization, and that is why we call this the Brancacci Chapel, because it was owned by the Brancacci family within the church. These chapels were extremely important to families because they established their presence not only within this specific church building, but also helps to establish them within the larger social constructs of the city. Because these chapels were paid for and maintained by specific families, they were expensive and they could be used as status or leverage in positions of power. And what we have here in the Brancacci Chapel is the Brancacci family showing their power and their status and their influence by hiring a specific, very important artist to do this really elaborate and gorgeous commission in their chapel. The idea being that you would then come into this church and you'd see it and be like, whoa, whose chapel is this? This is by the Brancacci family? This is impressive. Do you see how it adds to the status of the family? Okay, so that's why it's called the Brancacci Chapel. The artist is Masaccio, and Masaccio was hired to decorate the interior walls of the chapel. From this point of view, we see those exterior walls. We're going to be focusing in on one panel, but we also see that the chapel altar has this gorgeous, older Italian Gothic painting, and then the ceiling is done much later, so not part of the early Italian Renaissance. In comparison to what we saw in Giotto, it's very similar in that the artist has divided the scene into various panels. Now, Masaccio's Brancacci Chapel is focusing on the New Testament Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew, the book of Matthew. And so we're going to be following the story of Matthew and his experience and retellings of the life of Jesus along these panels. And as I said, we're only going to be looking at one panel in this chapel. In order for us to get a better sense of the scale or the size of this chapel, let's do this quick scan that's on YouTube. Let's walk through it together. So this is the panel we'll be looking at in more detail. When you're standing inside of the chapel, the figures, the bodies that you're seeing, they're almost life-size. I want you to notice the use of light and shadow, the chiaroscuro, the use of perspective, now oftentimes in artwork from this period, you'll see biblical figures and robes mixed in with people wearing clothes of the Renaissance, hosing and tunics. The reason for the blending of biblical figures with contemporary or Florentine figures is to connect or blend the faith with their everyday lives. That these miracles and moments of holy literature are happening in and around and are a part of their everyday existence. Now, the videographer here showing you the rest of the interior of the church. We're not going to hang out here because this was all redone later on, and it's not part of the early Renaissance. It's gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it was done much later, and it's not going to be part of our discussion. So here we are. The panel that we're going to look at in more detail is called the tribute money. So the artist is Masaccio. This panel is called the tribute money, and this is part of the Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. Now, what we're seeing here is a moment called the tribute money in which a Roman tax collector comes or confronts Jesus and his followers in town and demands payment. Jesus then tells Peter to go to the river where he catches a fish, and in the mouth of the fish is the exact amount of money that the tax collector has demanded. So Peter pays the tax collector, and the message of the story is that God will always provide. He will provide exactly what you need when you need it. So here we see three parts of the story blended together in one panel. Here we see the tax collector coming, Jesus instructing Peter. Now, it's always easy to figure out which one's Peter. Peter is usually going to have a gray hair and gray beard and a blue tunic with an orange robe or mantle. So write that down because you're going to see Peter wearing gray beard and hair, blue tunic, and an orange robe. And there he is. Second part of the story, he finds the fish in the mouth, he finds the money, and then we go over here and we see him paying the tax collector. So we see three parts of the narrative of the story in one scene. You know what's not needed for the scene? This building here. So why is it there? That's right, it's Masaccio. He's showing off. He's like, yeah, linear perspective, that new thing that's coming around, I can do it. He's showing you linear perspective to give you a sense of space, a sense of depth for the scene, but also just to show off he knows what's going on. What else do we see? What about chiaroscuro? Yes, we see highlights, midtones, and shadows across these figures. Remember that term, chiaroscuro? Here, let me pull it up again. There we go. So the modeling of highlights, midtones, and shadows with a consistent light source to give the illusion of three-dimensionality. So the light source is coming from over here, and it's casting shadows across the figures. Look at even these little cast shadows. So it really creates a more realistic representation of space and each other's bodies. And then in the distance, we see this far off mountain range. This also adds to our sense of space. The use of space is both linear perspective. Now you see how those are all receding to a single vanishing point? The vanishing point is right behind Jesus's head. Now I don't want you to think like, oh, how rude, Masaccio is putting the vanishing point right behind his head. No, think of it as symbolic. That vanishing point behind his head, it creates these radiating lines that come in and out from behind Jesus. So symbolically, what we're seeing is that everything begins and ends with Jesus. And it also helps to draw our attention to the center of the panel and to the most important figure in this scene, Jesus. Now I said that there were two uses of perspective, linear perspective, and there is another way of depicting depth or space or distance. And we're seeing it in the background, the mountains here. Do you know what that kind of perspective is called? It's called atmospheric perspective, or you might also hear it referred to as aerial perspective. Aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective, a technique of rendering depth or distance in painting by blurring color and details of objects perceived as receding from the picture plane. The definition is long and complicated, but you know exactly what aerial or atmospheric perspective is. Have you ever looked out at a landscape, maybe on a long drive? You see off in the distance the hazy back of a mountain range. That is atmospheric perspective. It's a natural phenomenon that already happens. It is literally when the atmosphere gets in the way. It's not that the mountains are a different color in the background. It's simply that all of the stuff in the middle and the light bouncing off of it has blurred or changed the color of those distant mountains. And that is what we're seeing here in Masaccio's mountains. He's aware of and using atmospheric perspective. The mountains that are closest to us are darker, it's dark gray, and as they recede into the distance, they become lighter, they become more blurry. He's giving us so much space because of atmospheric perspective. We think about how these figures are placed in the foreground or the front, right at the edge of this panel. And then we have the middle ground with Peter, and then that background just goes on and on and on and on into the distance. So he's not only giving us linear perspective, but atmospheric perspective. Ooh, that's a characteristic of the Italian Renaissance, or I should say, the Renaissance in general. So let's write that down. Characteristics of the Renaissance include linear perspective, chiaroscuro, atmospheric perspective, and then a balance of horizontals and verticals. Notice all of these figures standing in these vertical bodies, right? And then it's balanced by this long line of their heads. So that balance of verticals and horizontals. Now, one question that students often have whenever we're in class is, why does a Roman tax collector not have any pants on? Well, first of all, it's just as I said before, where there's often going to be, in Renaissance painting, a blend of biblical figures and contemporary figures. I mean contemporary as contemporaneous to the Renaissance. So this tax collector here, he's wearing a red tunic, and that's very typical of the Renaissance. But what he's missing are the tights. Typically, men in the Renaissance, you would have these heavy tunics, and then you would have these wool stockings that would go all the way up your leg, and you would be showing off your fine muscular legs. You don't skip a leg day. And also, if you want to be really risque, you'd make your tunic a little shorter. Woo! It was all the rage. Talk to me about fashion. Email me. Okay, so why is this tax collector very clearly missing his leggings, his hose? Why do we see his toes? That's a good question. Art historians, we love to say that we have all the answers, but we're not quite sure why this Roman tax collector is dressed like a Renaissance guy with no pants on. One educated guess is to keep him not anonymous, but unspecific. Oftentimes, or not oftentimes, when a man wears a tunic and hose, those colors of his hose or his stockings, his leggings, would clearly identify him to a family or a status. And think of it like wearing like gang colors. families have colors, and you would be able to identify this color tunic with this stocking of red and this stocking of green to be of this family. Oh, this blue tunic with this gold stocking and this blue stocking, that's a different family. So our historians think that the use of this, or lack of, stockings is a way to keep the tax collector unattached to a status or a family, to keep him more generic, more universal. It's just one assumption that we've made about the bottom nude tax collector.